sectors of the economy have been pushing for months to reopen, and now more economic activity will come online as we move to lockdown level 2.
However, how do we reset the economy, already on life support before the lockdown? For Rivers Analysts Managing Director Lebohang Pheko and Dr. Iraj Abedian of Pan-African Investment and Research join us on this now. We start with you, Lebohang Pheko. Ms. Pheko, good evening to you. We can all go out, we can enjoy ourselves again, we can drink, we can smoke if we want to, we can even cross provincial borders to go to some sort of tourist establishment. But is there actually any demand for these services?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think as soon as the restaurants opened during the last level adjustment, there was an assumption that there'd be quite a deluge of people popping out for dinner, and really that hasn't happened in significant numbers. That's also partly because most people couldn't enjoy a glass of wine or whatever they enjoy with their dinner, but also I think there was just a general hesitance to be around too many people in confined spaces. But over the last few weeks, that seems to have been adjusted. But I also think that the psychosocial impact of having been cooped up for like 120 days that are beginning to wear down on people, and this is manifesting in much less reticence in moving outwards. But I think we should be more concerned about ways in which we can continue to live our lives responsibly, whilst of course chasing the curve and reducing the possibility of infections. But I think it's inevitable that we cannot stay in our houses or in our apartments ad infinitum, particularly at a time when social life is one that is very sustaining and nourishing to us.
Much of this is done to try and get the economy back on track. How long is it going to take, and what happens, as you're saying to Stephen, if the demand for many of these services simply doesn't rise to the occasion?
Well, I mean, Kathy, I think that, bearing in mind, as you rightly said, as you both rightly said, that this is an economy that was not exactly clothed in glory in terms of performance before this. I mean, we had 4 quarters, three significant quarters, and consecutive quarters of no growth or slow growth. Supposedly a technical recession. I think we've been in recession for about 24 months off and on. And I also think that, it points to the fact that there are structural issues and systemic issues which were not attended to even before COVID. It's been said, and let's just say it again, that things like social, developmental, health, and educational infrastructure, the fragilities and the ongoing weaknesses of that have been exposed even more strongly in this time. And I think that, given that the economy has been flagging for at least 24 months and that it's been taking a particular beating and an unprecedented beating during this period, unemployment was already extremely poor, and it's been, of course, contracting even more strongly since COVID-19. I don't see us going back to normal. I think that the old normal was very problematic, for one thing. But secondly, that if we want to see things systemically moving in a different direction, the state needs to think about reigniting policy, reigniting key parts of the economy, and rethinking trickle-down theory significantly, because it clearly doesn't work. Over the next at least 36 to 60 months, 3 to 5 years, I would say, before things look like they should. And I think that this notion of building back better, I don't think we should build back pit latrines, build back lack of sanitation, build back poor transport infrastructure, build back the poor health care which has been exposed very badly in this time, and certainly build back the racialized lack of equitable service delivery and access to basic services that we've seen in this time.
Dr. Abedian, if we can just move to you. There was a lot of talk of proper reform at the start of the lockdown. Finance Minister Tito Mboweni had his famous hallelujah moment. We've had NEDLAC consultation after NEDLAC consultation. There doesn't seem to be any reform in the pipeline, or are you seeing something I'm not?
No, I think there is an absolute policy paralysis we have had. In fact, quite frankly, even before COVID-19, if you go back to, more than a year ago, in the second State of the Nation, the President promised changes in the energy sector, structural reform, not business as usual, a new dawn. None of it has happened. It's been all hollow, empty. And that has created a serious problem. Remember, we are downgraded, junk graded, and even before the COVID-19 crisis, the economy went from technical recession to actual recession. Why? Because there's been a policy paralysis. There is no unanimity in the cabinet. There is no singular vision of what we want to do with this economy. And of course, the virus crisis just kicked us right down the hill.
Of course, in the midst of all of this, our costs still continue to grow. So SOEs still need to pay their bills. And we're seeing the situation with SAA recently. It's been denied that simply doesn't have money and is struggling to pay salaries. What must happen in the interim, if at least to try and ensure that these companies are able to navigate their way into the short to medium term if they're to stay online, I suppose even beyond that?
I think, Kathy, that your point of if they're going to stay along, that's a big if. These companies, SAA particularly, has been corrupt and corrupted beyond recognition. Can we keep them? The answer is no. Crisis or no crisis, it's always the right time to do the right thing. To use the crisis to create more corruption and more siphoning out of borrowed money is not the right thing to do. So I think what needs to be done, and I think Lebohang alluded to, we got to really do a reset completely in terms of how we govern, how we make policies. For example, the very first day on the 26th of March when the president announced the lockdown and saving lives, in the same speech, the president knew, we knew, everybody knew that when you put the lockdown on the economy, you're causing recession, mandatory recession. We didn't have a choice in saving lives. But at the same time, in the same speech, he should put a team together within days, not years and months and weeks, within days to come up with a reboot plan. And now, even as we speak, there is nothing. There is promise after promise. The same line is repeated. It doesn't deliver. That's the problem. The economy cannot reboot itself. The economy reboots when certain actions are taken, and we are not taking it because we are in a policy paralysis.
Ms. Pheko, I must ask, I mean, we've had this policy paralysis, some people might argue 15 years or even longer, and economic reforms in all countries are very controversial. I mean, it's the real essence of politics and economic reform. Is that why we haven't actually seen this? Is that still the problem? And if that is the reason, that means we're not going to magically have economic reform now if the politics hasn't shifted.
No, exactly. I mean, in the midst of a real crisis, when we really should be thinking about much more radical, I mean, I think rather than build back better, building forward radically, and rather than trying to siphon and smuggle in structural adjustment programs through the high indebted loans that are being procured, and the privatization of essential public services like healthcare, like social protection systems, which are so needed, like water and sanitation systems, and instead of creating COVIDpreneurs and COVID millionaires, we really ought to be going back to the basics of a few basic things, such as how we get an economy to work. That means people who are healthy, so we need to get the healthcare up and running and effective and accessible. We also need to go back to think around how the education system needs to be regalvanized in order to create a skilled force and a workforce that is compatible with the kind of economy that we want to develop. And this is something I've been saying for many years, that we're very indecisive about what kind of economy we want to be. Is it STEM? Is it the fourth industrial revolution? Which is it? What are the things that we want to be good at? We also need to think about reconsidering issues like Wi-Fi data. I mean, people think that this is just a Twitter line that, data must fall. But we have seen over the last 120 days or so how difficult it is to function if one is completely outside the digital divide and is not able to access learning materials, is not able to access screen time. And we've also seen again that it's very important for us to have an energy compact which is effective. So now and again, the intermittent load shedding that takes place under already difficult circumstances, which hampers productivity completely, and also curtails already difficult working days for many communities. So for people who live in middle class areas, your generator will kick off or you'll just, write off the day. But for people who are the majority African people in this country, living in high density areas or in rural areas or in urban locations and townships, for whom, public safety is a real issue, for whom, the being in the dark is a real issue. And then in the same breath, we talk about violence against women. In the same breath, we talk about lengthening productivity. And in the same breath, we also talk about being a global leader and globally competitive. This is also at a time when things like the basic income grant need to come into the fore. We have to reconsider the social compact between the people and the state. And we really should think about the social compact as a mechanism to enable most people, everybody in this country, to participate meaningfully in this economy, rather than being the humiliation of standing at the robots in abject poverty. And I don't really buy the dogma that we can't afford a social grant system. We actually already have one. What we can't afford is for the kind of debacles we've seen at SASA. We can't afford for money to be diverted, and food parcels that to be diverted, which are intended for the indigent communities and the African majority in this country. So many, new solutions, but to old existing problems.
You've both alluded to the need for this economic reform, but if we look at where we are now and the current track record, there simply seems to be no political will to implement it. Dr. Iraj, what happens when nothing changes? So if we stay in the state that we're in for the next coming months or even years, what will be the impact?
Impoverishment, misery and suffering. This time around, in the name of democracy and supporting the poor and all that slogans that have become completely empty and unfortunately anti-poor and anti-working class. There should be absolutely no misunderstanding or confusion. Every day that the cabinet refuses to get off this policy paralysis, more jobs are lost in tens of thousands, more poverty is created, average GDP goes down, the economy gets downgraded even more and more. There are millions, or not millions, there are hundreds of examples globally of cases that when policy paralysis sits and when political leadership fails to rise up to the occasion, the result is only one predictable outcome: impoverishment and misery.
Dr. Iraj Abedian and Lebohang Pheko from Rivers Analysts, really do appreciate your time today. That's a fascinating conversation. Unfortunately, Kathy, one I'm afraid that we might be condemned to have again in the future.
Absolutely.